Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, part of the Jobs with Impact compendium of resources for people who want to make a positive impact on the world. I'm David Rosenheim, your host. Every week, we bring you in-depth conversations with people who are leading the way to a sustainable future. I hope these conversations will be as inspiring to you as they are to me, and most of all, I hope that they'll empower you to take action. The planet needs you. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to jobswithimpact.com. Brenden Millstein is co-founder and CEO of Carbon Lighthouse. I first got to know Brenden when his company had a single handful of employees trying to prove their optimized energy management technology to building owners in the Bay Area. Fast forward 6 or so years, and Carbon Lighthouse has close to 90 employees and has eliminated emissions equivalent to 6 power plants with another 9 under contract. Brenden and his team is razor focused on this single goal, eliminating as many greenhouse gas emissions as possible. Brenden's vision for Carbon Lighthouse was shaped by early experiences studying physics at Harvard and engineering and business at Stanford, and through his work administering commercial building energy programs for NYSERDA, which is New York State's energy planning and research agency. In our conversation, we discuss his beginnings at Berkeley High, his experience breakdancing for Busta Rhymes, and his outlook on the climate challenge, a fight that he sees us winning. Brenden shares his insights on working in the clean energy economy and is candid about his successes and his stumbling blocks in building a successful clean energy company. Brenden Millstein, thanks so much for joining the podcast today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Dave. Happy to be here.
It's good to see you. So I got to ask before we get going, what is your history with breakdancing?
Okay. The history with breakdancing. So I played capoeira in high school, which is a Brazilian martial art that combines martial arts and dance and gymnastics into one. And when I got to college, I assumed I could keep playing, but there weren't a lot of people at Harvard who had done capoeira. So a friend of mine from high school and I, she had done capoeira. We'd done it together. So we started a capoeira club at Harvard and started teaching a whole bunch of people. And after about a year of that, we transitioned it to a formal mestre, and I switched to breakdancing because surprisingly, there was a actually quite good breakdancing crew at Harvard.
At Harvard?
At Harvard, yes.
That is surprising.
It was small. There were 3 of us, or really 3 of them, and then I joined, so then there were 4 of us. So it was small, but they were really good, and I turned out to be adept at hustling gigs. And so we had Busta Rhymes was coming to Boston to do a show. And we'd been hustling gigs all over Boston. And so we tracked down his people who were running the show. And I told them, hey, I run the best breakdancing crew in all of Boston. You have to give us an audition. So they agreed to give us an audition. And so then we called up all of the best breakdancers in the greater Boston area and said, hey, guys, come join our crew. We have an audition for Busta Rhymes. And so, within 3 days, we in fact had by far the best breakdancing crew in all of Boston. So we showed up for audition, nailed it, because best crew in Boston. And then we got to open for Busta Rhymes, which was definitely the culmination of my breakdancing career. So
that's a pretty high level though. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was a short but strong career. It's like Art Garfunkel of breakdancing, maybe. Yeah. But yeah, so that's the history there. I was never a very good breakdancer, but I was able
I'd love to see it. I don't know if it's YouTubeable or...
No, thankfully, most of my childhood shenanigans were pre-YouTube.
Yeah.
So sort of lucked out there.
So you grew up in Berkeley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
And when did you sort of first connect with environmentalism? I mean, was this something that you experienced as a kid or that you kind of got the insight later on?
Yeah. This I was definitely exposed as a kid. My family didn't have a lot of money growing up, and so our family vacation every year was backpacking because once you have the gear, it's free, right? Because you need food anyways. And so starting when I was 3, I started backpacking, and I remember I carried my sleeping bag, I think 1.2 miles to our site. So
Wow.
really proud of myself. And that's really when I started falling in love with the natural environment.
And was this in Northern California?
Yeah, that particular trip was in Yosemite. And we've backpacked all over California, and Utah and Arizona too, actually. But where I really became passionate about the cause behind Carbon Lighthouse was in high school. Berkeley, this was in the 90s, so it was before even the first dot-com boom, and there's only one high school. And Berkeley was, at the time, a very mixed town. There were, sons and daughters of professors, kids, and kids from parts of Berkeley that were really struggling. And one high school, so very mixed. I think it was 30% black, 30% white, 30% Hispanic, and 10% Asian. So incredibly diverse school. And really no middle to the school whatsoever. So we sent 7 kids to Harvard from my class. And we had, in my 4 years, 6 principals and 20 fires, one of which burnt down the B building. And I spent high school.
Oh, wait, what were these fires? Was this arson?
It was arson. It ended up being a disgruntled former staff member. The one that burnt down the B building was kind of scary. I think he locked the teacher's staff room. No one was in there, thankfully, but filled it with gasoline, locked it, and lit it. That was intense. And that was there was a lot of special ed in the B building, which was both mental, but also kids who had physical handicaps were kind of based there. And so we were running across the fire line, pulling out wheelchairs and stuff. That was a very intense day. I spent a lot of high school really struggling to help anyone around me. And I basically gave up on thinking that low-income education was solvable. But my senior year of high school, I took a nuclear engineering class at UC Berkeley and just fell in love. And here is this way to use math to improve the lives of billions of people. And, totally unlike education, the financial incentives were totally aligned. We could just hand people money to do the right thing. And so, I was good at math, and the financial incentives were aligned, and we could help billions of people. So that's what I wanted to do. And so fast forward, a decade from then, and here we are at Carbon Lighthouse, and our business model is literally to take money away from power plants and split it with ourselves and our clients and their tenants. And it works great. Yeah. So far we've eliminated 6 power plants worth of emissions, and we have another 9 under contract, and have grown, I think, much faster than Moore's Law, actually, for 9 years running.
It's been amazing to watch your growth, and I want to really dig into that, but I want to spend a little bit more time on your background. So in college you studied physics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And did you deal with energy specifically in that course of study?
Yeah, a little bit. So undergraduate physics, there's a lot of basics in physics to cover, so there's not a lot of room for specializing at the undergraduate level. So definitely looked at energy systems and renewables and some stuff with wind power. But undergraduate training was pretty general physics. It was really in graduate school where I went to Stanford for grad school and got an MBA, but I also got a master's in engineering there, and there I was really able to focus in clean energy systems.
Was that specifically focused on renewable energy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So how is that a common path? I mean, that seems like a pretty unique package to put together an MBA and engineering with an emphasis on renewable energy.
Yeah. Well, so I didn't. Okay, so the quick history was, at the end of college, I followed a girlfriend at the time to New York, and there was relatively little clean energy going on in New York, and so at the time. And so my options were to go to a lab at Columbia University or Brookhaven National Labs, or work for NYSERDA, which was a state agency. And so I ended up working for a state agency. I was based in Manhattan. And so there is really where I started getting more applied.
So this was immediately as a just having graduated college, and NYSERDA, let's just define that a little bit. It's the state of New York's energy planning agency, essentially, or?
Yeah, it's a lovely acronym. It's the New York State Energy and Research Development Authority. And it's this cool government entity that I think only New York State has, which is an authority, not an agency. And so it's this weird thing. It gets a mandate from the legislature, but no real control from the legislature, and it's funded by like a tiny little charge on everyone in New York's electric bill. And then it operates kind of independently from the state, but management is all appointed by the governor. And so it's the agency, the main agency or authority technically responsible in New York for R&D funding for clean energy and programs as well, so energy efficiency programs. Like really, it has a large budget. It uses that budget to do R&D funding. That's somewhat similar to CEC. But then, I had a $90 million budget for the program I was co-administering in New York to reduce energy consumption in New York. And after I left, that program budget expanded to $250 million.
And so talk about that program specifically. Yeah. This was directed at commercial buildings in Manhattan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and really all of New York City. And so the hurdle we were faced with, this was back in 2006, and so Manhattan and actually all the boroughs were transmission constrained. So basically there's a higher demand for power than ability to get power into the city. And so you have limited options. So you can build more transmission. That takes 10 years. I think thankfully a lot of those projects are done now. But you have to deal with things before 10 years are up. And then you can find some land in the Bronx to plop down a power plant. That's basically just not going to happen. Or you can pay a bunch of engineers to run around New York figuring out how landlords can cut energy use. And then essentially bribe them to do so. So that was my job, which was an amazing job for a 22-year-old because my whole team was up in New York. Was up in Albany. And so anyone would meet with me because here was this 22-year-old kid with a $90 million budget and seemingly no oversight, which was actually completely
Sounds
inaccurate.
Dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. But that was only an appearance. I had 3 bosses at the same time, which you'd think would be not great, but actually it was amazing because every single one of these guys, Lee, my direct supervisor, and then Chris and Pete, who also gave me a lot of work, every single one of those 3 was an amazing engineer, a fantastic mentor, and because I was remote, being able to call all of them was really helpful because I could always reach at least one person and get help. So this was this great learning experience for me. I could meet with anyone in New York I wanted to because I had this crazy budget. And then, I could get all the help and mentoring and learning that my heart desired from these 3 amazing mentors.
And how, just before we move on from NYSERDA, how does an authority like NYSERDA do its hiring? Does it have recruiting relationships directly with universities? If somebody wanted to work in that capacity, what's the path?
Back when I was there, and this was more than a decade ago, hiring was a problem. And our group was growing. So hiring was a problem. Our group was very successful. And so the PSC agreed to expand our budget very dramatically. So when I started, I think the peak load reduction program had a $17 or a $19 million budget. And when I left, it had a $90 million budget. And then 2 years after that, it had a $250 million budget. And so we went from a place where not being able to hire well wasn't such a problem to a real problem. And so I helped a little bit to get us set up for hiring. So I wasn't replaced with one person. I was replaced with 4. And so I did a lot on the recruitment front that I'll just be really blunt. They shouldn't have had me doing that. HR should have been doing that. HR was not doing that well. There were some real problems there. It has now been more than a decade. I have no idea what's going on.
Fair. Okay, so NYSERDA, how long were you there, and what was the impetus for your going to grad school back here in California?
Yeah, so NYSERDA was an amazing experience. I ultimately got frustrated with my inability to do things outside of state bounds, and you cannot stop climate change from one state. So the private sector was very appealing. in that, it can expand globally if it needs to and quite quickly. So I had no significant private sector experience. So I went to Stanford for business school with the goal, actually not of starting a company, but of joining a different clean energy company that was cheaper than fossil fuels, and that my job ideally would be to help it expand as quickly as we could. And so that was my goal for why I wanted to go to Stanford for business school.
And were you thinking energy efficiency and optimization at that time, or more on the generation side, or the full range?
Oh, full range. I don't care as long as it's cheap. Whether it's efficiency, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's something else, doesn't matter at all to me as long as it reduces our demand for fossil fuels and doesn't need subsidies. That part I think is really important, because if it needs subsidies, it's not going to be able to grow as quickly. It will be at the whims of politics rather than the whims of people acting in their own self-interest. And I trust people to be greedy much more than I trust politicians. Totally technology agnostic. I added the engineering degree because once I got to Stanford, I discovered it was an incredibly magical place, and I wanted to extend my time there. So that was unplanned. But then, starting my second year of business school, Raphael and I decided to start the company. And so then I wanted to finish as quickly as I could. So I ended up compressing the MBA and MS into 2 years. So my last semester was a little nutty. So we were starting the company too at the time.
So and Raphael's a childhood friend, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Raphael and I were physics lab partners at Harvard together. He abandoned me for private high school, but that's okay. And otherwise, we grew up 5 blocks apart and been best friends since kindergarten.
That's
so
incredible.
Like 3 decades.
So let's talk about the genesis for Carbon Lighthouse.
Yeah. So we started the company at the end of 2009. And the hurdle was I'd gone to Stanford with a dream of finding an existing clean energy company that was already cheaper than fossil fuels. And the goal was to help it grow. And the problem was in 2009, that company didn't exist. So, solar was, I think, 8 times as expensive in 2009 as it is today. Wind was maybe 2 or 3 times as expensive as it is today. Batteries were literally catching on fire. There's just... that didn't exist. What I wanted didn't exist. The only thing that was cheaper than fossil fuels on an unsubsidized basis was energy efficiency. And the problem is that's not good enough. We can only efficiency our way out of 20 or 30% of the problem. And that doesn't work. We can't reduce emissions by 30% and stop. We have to get to 100% reduction in emissions. And probably at that point, we'll need to figure out how to suck carbon out of the air. But we can deal with that in 2030. The concept of the company was, okay, we have this thing. It's cheaper than fossil fuels on an unsubsidized basis. That's efficiency. But it doesn't get us the whole way there. So what we're going to do is we're going to start an efficiency company, and that will be very profitable for us and very profitable for clients, and that's requisite for expanding really quickly and getting to the scale that's needed overall to actually make a dent at the problem. But we're also going to start a nonprofit, and the for-profit will donate some of its proceeds to the nonprofit. And there's 10 states in the U.S. where every power plant by law needs to buy one operating permit from the government for each ton of CO2 it emits. And due to wonderful and fascinating lobbying battles that took place in 2003 through 2005, those markets are open. So anyone who can navigate the 600-page stack of legalese and bid in the minimum block size can just go buy these permits. And there's a fixed number of these permits. So our nonprofit just goes to these auctions and buys down the supply of permits, and coal power plants, can't afford the increase in price. So we run a little bit less coal and a little bit more natural gas. And that way, whatever environmental impact we can eliminate on site, we balance off of site by forcing utilities to run a slightly cleaner grid.
So this is the Carbon Lighthouse Association, right?
Yeah.
And I think I read that you've retired the equivalent of 3 power plants through those investments.
Yeah, actually, I think we're up to 4 now, but yeah.
And just to break it down a little bit for listeners, this is investing in the cap and trade market here in California, as well as the regional greenhouse gas initiative market on the East Coast.
Yeah.
Now, why did you decide to invest in retiring these permits rather than investing, say, in the voluntary offset market?
Yeah, great question. For two reasons. The first and most important is that these markets are incredibly well enforced and regulated. So the regional greenhouse gas initiative, there are, because of prices, essentially zero offsets. It's just permits for power plants.
They have a provision to allow for offsets, but they've never actually enacted it or enabled it.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's just permits for power plants. The power plants are very heavily fined if they are caught operating without a permit, and the states get the revenue from those fines. So enforcement is really good and easy, right? There's no forest that was built in some other country that you need to send someone to see if it's actually there, and maybe it was there before and you didn't know, or maybe it's there and they've sold the credits to 500 different buyers, and not just double counted, but 500x counted it. Like there's just a lot of hurdles in offsets, and some offsets are very good. Particularly, I think methane capture from landfills that's very verifiable. There's good tracking around that to avoid double counting. Like that, those can be very good offsets, but there's a lot of hurdles in the voluntary offset market, including just complete outright fraud. And the mandatory markets just don't have that.
Do you see other, and this is a bit of a tangent, but I'm fascinated that you took this strategy, because you look at a lot of corporations that have carbon neutral goals and are achieving those goals through a variety of means, on-site renewable generation, investments in energy efficiency, and also sort of for the last bit, investing in carbon offsets. I don't see a lot of these voluntary purchasers going directly into the compliance markets in this way. Am I getting that wrong? Do you see others doing this as well?
No, you're very right. Carbon Lighthouse Carbon Lighthouse Association is the only non-bank, non-power plant that reliably participates in these markets. Some corporations do find us and have us do the purchasing for them, so they don't show up in those markets because they're doing it through us. But part of the reason corporations don't do this is twofold. So Google, for example, she's moved to a different role, but they had a woman named Giolanka who was incredibly bright and talented.
I remember her.
Yeah, and she just flew all around the world doing landfill methane capture. And so that was actually cheaper to hire someone to do that directly. So some corporations are very good at doing that. I know Cisco is very active in the REC market and funding renewable energy projects in the U.S., which also have very good enforcement and additionality. So some companies are finding other ways to do it more cost effectively. But the second reason we did Reggie and AB 32 markets are that they're actually cheaper than voluntary offset markets. And this is a temporary market
anomaly.
Anomaly. But we can buy amazing, regulated, well-enforced, one-for-one reductions in carbon emissions at literally half the price of going to the voluntary offset markets. And that won't last forever. Ideally, so many people will start doing this through Carbon Lighthouse Association that will drive the prices up, which is the whole point. But for now, it's actually cheaper. So it's just that it's really esoteric and few people know about it.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting message to try to amplify, which I'm sure you're doing.
Yeah, we should amplify it in the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. So let's bring it back to the core work, though, of Carbon Lighthouse, not the association. Mm-hmm. What is, how has your thinking and your strategy changed since the founding? And what are your sort of top services now?
Yeah. So there's one thesis we had at the very beginning of the company, which is really two theses, which have driven everything we do. And those have not changed. The way we accomplish those things has changed. So the two the two kind of like founding principles of the company, I will say, are whatever we do needs to be profitable for customers and profitable for us, because otherwise there is no way to grow large enough overall quickly enough to matter. The second principle was that the financial incentives for us and customers need to be aligned with the environmental benefit we are trying to deliver, because otherwise we will end up straying from our mission. So we set up the company to ideally make lots of profit when we reduce lots of emissions and make no money whatsoever when we don't reduce emissions. And those two things have driven everything we've done. And there ended up being amazing business advantages from setting things up like that. And those advantages we didn't foresee at all whatsoever. But like, I'll give you a couple fun examples. We immediately started trying to tackle third-party owned commercial real estate. So namely office buildings, industrial buildings, buildings where there's one party that owns the building and they lease out space to other, to tenants. And the reason to tackle this sector is that in the US, 40% of emissions come from commercial and industrial buildings. So it's the single largest source of emissions. And the reason to tackle third-party owned buildings is that 70% of commercial and industrial buildings are third-party owned, and there are exactly 0 other firms that can work successfully and reliably in those buildings. So the single largest source of emissions is going completely untouched, both in the US and the rest of the world, which is part of our problem. So as an environmental firm, we said, okay, great, don't care how hard it is, we need to solve this problem. So we went straight there. And that was really hard. It turns out there's a reason no one else is working in this sector. There's actually 100 reasons, and they're all that it's really hard for this or that challenging detail. But after years and years and years of just slamming our heads against this problem and trying a million different things, we were able to break through. And the business consequence of this is that we are all alone in a $50 billion potential market, and we've been doubling revenue and doubling our CO2 impact every 14 months for 8.5 years.
It's amazing. So what's the secret? What's the secret sauce?
Yeah. So a second thing happened as a result of our two premises of make it profitable for customers and align the financial incentives with the environmental benefit. And the second thing combined with tackling commercial real estate, those two things combined to be our special sauce. So the second thing was actually our contract structure, which is we charge a fixed monthly fee. That's it. Very simple. And in exchange for that fee, we guarantee we'll deliver energy savings above a certain amount. And that's the contract. Savings are greater than expected, client keeps it. If they're less than expected, we write a check to cover the difference. And we're in about 600 buildings now. We've had to refund about 1% of our total revenue to refunds. So it happens. It's challenging to predict things perfectly ahead of time, but it's pretty good. And that contract structure forced us to develop a totally different technical system. So what ended up happening was, we'd sign this contract where we're on the hook to deliver savings, and then we get to the building, and the building would be perfect. Low-hanging fruit gone, medium-hanging fruit gone, like equipment's brand new, like there's no opportunity in this building. And it was so hard to win initial sales for all of these reasons, us being bad at sales, very much one of them, that we had, finally, when we won a building, we had $10,000 to our name. There was no apparent way to save energy. We were two panicked, nerdy physicists, as back in 2010. So we were like, let's get $2,000 of sensors and measure everything and pray someone missed something in the data. And sure enough, they had. And we could turn off some fan that the control system thought it was turning off. And that let us save 3% of the whole building energy. And the next time we won a building, same thing happened, but we had $20,000 now. So we got $4,000 worth of sensors, and we could eke out, there was some pump that was operating when it shouldn't have been. And actually it did need to operate more than we thought it did. So we ended up turning off all of the air conditioning when it was 105 degrees out. So that was very bad. But we fixed it and we learned, and kind of each time we won a building, we got more data, we got a little bit more sophisticated, and about 4 years after that, so 2014, we had this technical system where we were delivering energy savings 10 times more cost effectively than anyone else. And we could guarantee the results financially. We could take all the risk. And the savings were large, 10 to 30% whole building energy savings without any major new equipment.
And this is after these buildings had already done, as you say, the low-hanging fruit.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
And so this puts you in this, I was going to ask sort of how you characterize this sector, because I've heard you talk about, okay, well, there's the ESCO model, the energy service companies that are installing control systems. And there's software companies that run some of those systems and run the optimization. And you sort of have developed this hybrid model where you're using sensors to optimize the management of systems that are already in place. So a minute ago you said, you're alone in a $50 billion market. What do you call yourselves? Like what is this? Yeah. What is this sector that you're pioneering?
Yeah, we're a clean energy company, and we actually, somewhat ironically, take our strategy very directly from oil companies. So oil companies, you go to a gas station, you don't pay for the rig, you don't pay for the derrick, you don't pay for the test wells, like you just pay for the gas. That's it. And we very much believe commercial buildings should just pay for the energy they use and not the energy that's wasted. And so in the same way oil companies have oil reserves, we look at an individual building with the concept of efficiency reserves, which is how much wasted energy is there in that building that we can eliminate and turn into revenue for the client and their tenants and ourselves. And then the other thing we take from oil companies is the contract structure, which is, is it accountable and simple? So say what you will of oil companies. If you show up with a gallon bucket and you pump what the machine says is a gallon and your bucket's half full, you have someone to sue. There is accountability on the other side. They will give you a known amount of gas for a known amount of money. And the efficiency industry has been almost totally the opposite. There's an awful lot of buy this piece of equipment, it'll save you energy, but the contract is for the equipment. Or hire us as consultants will save you energy, but the contract is for a report. And so we charge a fixed monthly fee and we guarantee savings above a certain dollar amount. And if they're less than that, we write a check to cover the difference. And so ESCOs do this, but in the mush market. So for municipalities, for universities, for school districts, for hospitals. But they have been unable to do it cost effectively in commercial real estate. And what our technology lets us do is get up to 30% whole building energy savings, but without replacing major equipment. And that unlocks a huge variety of buildings that ESCOs can't work in cost effectively. But also a pure software company can't deliver real bankable results. Like buildings are real, they change every 6 months, tenants move in and out. Like if you don't understand that a space that was an office is now a gym, your software is pretty useless. So you need to combine elements from all of these different sectors to create an energy company, and that is what we do.
So it's obviously working. I think the last time I was in your office, there were maybe 3 of you in the flood building. I think it was during the period that you're describing when you were, going from one client to the next and trying to find something that worked. You're now up to 85 staff of 85 or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you are both raising money for the growth of your company, but also for the project finance side, and you've been very successful in both. Earlier this year, you raised a strategic growth round of $35 million. You also closed, I think, your third project finance round with Generate Capital of $65 million. Can you talk a little bit about what you're going to do with these funds and what sort of the next phase of growth is?
Yeah, absolutely. And quick clarification, the $35 million growth round was actually 2017. And then the third project finance fund was $65 million in this year with Generate Capital. But that's not for corporate growth.
Right.
That's just for, all the software in the world doesn't help you if the maintenance guy needs to physically walk over to a pump and change a valve to change that pump's behavior. So there's not no equipment in our projects. There's just not major construction because we will install controls so that pump can be automated. Mm-hmm. And then once that one-time work is done, the rest is almost fully automated. So the project finance fund is to cover those one-time costs so that customers don't need to pay anything out of pocket.
Okay.
And the use of those proceeds at this point is just scaling up to do much more of the same. So we're in a little more than 600 buildings now across the US, and there are 1 million commercial and industrial buildings. So there's a little bit of work left to do. Another way to think of it is we've eliminated the emissions of 6 power plants, and by the way we track power plants, there's about 50,000 more to go, or 49,994 to go. So the growth capital is to hire more personnel, both the engineers we send to buildings to deploy sensors, but also software and data scientists to automate more stuff on the back end, as well as expand the business development and marketing teams. And then the project capital is to work in many, many more buildings so that we can continue to enable customers to get energy savings and actually direct revenue without any out-of-pocket capital.
And I want to talk more about, dig into a little bit more about sort of who works here and how you hire. But I just want to bring up, right, we're sitting here in December of 2018, and the UN climate talks are taking place right now in Poland. The news earlier this week is not good. Right? Emissions went up for a second year in a row. People had thought that maybe we were at peak. Now it's pretty evident with China's resurging economy that we're not at peak emissions. And the window for mitigating climate change by many measures is closing very quickly. So what's your take on this? You know, you are very focused on climate change as being your target in this whole enterprise. What is most important now in our battle to save the planet?
Yeah. So I'm actually very optimistic here. And I think part of this is acceptance that we lost round one in this fight. There will be some warming. That's a done deal. We lost that fight half a century ago. But why I am optimistic is that we are going to win the second round, and that is going to end up being the important one. The one where we can head off the next ice age, where we don't need to have every major city demolished by hurricanes every year. Like there is some warming which is bad and has cost, and then there's like catastrophic, as bad as a nuclear holocaust climate change. And we can avoid the catastrophic, like truly, truly horrible, massive death and human cost of life problems. So that makes me excited. And the reason I am so optimistic about this is, and the UN comment is great, which is we're past the point where politics matter. So politics can accelerate our ability to stop climate change, and that's great, but it's too late for them to hinder it. So it doesn't matter what the president of the US says. It is cheaper than fossil fuels to build clean energy. And in 2009, when we were starting the company, that was not the case. Like, you needed subsidies. But now, even though oil and gas and coal are massively, massively subsidized, it's still cheaper to build wind, and it's still cheaper to build solar. And the cost of batteries has been plummeting. So we have the ability to make renewable sources non-intermittent. And that does increase their cost, but it's still cheaper than a lot of fossil fuels. And the way to see this most easily is to look at what really poor countries that don't have natural resources are doing, because they can't afford subsidies. And almost 100% of what's being built in those countries is solar and wind. So it is cheaper. And I like economic incentives because I think ultimately they win. So that makes me extremely encouraged. We're seeing at Carbon Lighthouse, I think almost half our projects now include solar, because even though it is, a little bit of capital, which is unlike the rest of our work, it's so cost effective and the returns are so good, and you can get a strongly above market return from doing solar. We had our first proposal come out with batteries recently, where we're laying the groundwork to take the building entirely off grid, which would be a net zero building, like not even on a net base. It would just be a zero energy building. Um, so that's very exciting.
So you really are a full clean energy company. You go into a building and you're like, okay, how are we going to achieve these goals? How are we going to reduce cost, or in some cases go net zero? And that might include the sort of more traditional carbon lighthouse approach of optimizing energy efficiency. It might now include installing solar on the rooftop. It might
Yeah.
include installing batteries.
Yeah, absolutely. The One of the wonderful things about what our software called Clues lets us do is we can figure out ahead of time exactly the costs and exactly the savings such that we can put those things in a contract, and Carbon Lighthouse can take all of the financial risk around everything. So we figure out with the client just very directly ahead of time. We go, what is the financial hurdle you're trying to hit? Are you trying to return shareholders 12%, 18%? Like, what's your number that makes you excited? And then we just put that in our software as a screening criteria. We get sensors out on site, and then it spits out, this is everything you can do in this building that cuts energy costs that will return greater than this threshold. And so it's a merging of the financial with the technology, but because it's software, anytime we model a technology once, we can just immediately apply that to all of the hundreds and hundreds of buildings in our portfolio, plus all of new potential customers. And the cool thing about the ongoing service, well, one of many cool things, is that as technologies come down in price, we can go back to our existing customers and say, hey, we started working together 3 years ago. We could get you 20% savings. Let's sign a one-page contract addendum, and we can actually up the monthly savings significantly because all of this stuff is now cost-effective that wasn't 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So the entire innovation of the whole industry around buildings is something we can leverage with our clients and use to make them more money and cut more emissions.
How do you measure success?
When the planet stops warming, we will be successful, and then someone else will have to figure out how to cool it. So we track everything in terms of power plants eliminated. That's our measure of success. Another way of looking at it is from the client perspective, which is what did we promise to clients and what did we actually deliver? And almost all of our clients are getting more than we promised to them. The average right now is 7.6% over. So if we've told people we'll save them $100,000 a year, they're getting $107,000 or $108,000 a year. So as long as clients are getting the financials they expected and we're getting the CO2 reductions we want, and we are doubling every year, we will stop climate change before it is too late.
I love your optimism and enthusiasm and laser focus.
We don't lack for focus.
So let's kind of shift a little bit and talk again about careers, not so much yours, but the kind of jobs that Carbon Lighthouse supports and how you see more broadly job opportunities in the clean energy industry.
Yeah. So thankfully, the clean energy industry is now very well developed in a way it wasn't 15 years ago. And I say this because there are hundreds of small companies and startups people could join, but also dozens to maybe 100 of very large companies. So like GE is having some challenges right now. Their wind turbine division isn't.
Right.
Like that is a strong division within GE.
And then the massive growth that we're going to see in offshore wind over the next few years is going to support their growth as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's not just true for GE. That's true for Siemens. That's true for Gamesa. That's true for Ventas. That's true for Goldwind, which is one of China's largest wind companies. So there are these multi-billion-dollar international conglomerates that have extremely thriving renewable energy divisions. ABB makes power electronics for all of this stuff. They're very involved in battery development. That's also a huge international company. There's so many large companies that are doing this now, and that not just now, but that have been doing it for a while. So now have hundreds or thousands of people working on this. And I think the latest job numbers I saw were that there were more people employed in solar in California alone than in the entire coal industry in the U.S. And I think the number nationally was like 10 times higher or something. So these are big industries.
It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So, at Carbon Lighthouse, we have a huge range of jobs that we are near constantly hiring for. I will preface this, I will say we've had exceptionally low turnover. So there's 85 people at the company now. Our annual average turnover rate has been less than 2%. I think that's 30 times better than national average. So we're very, very proud of. But we hire for positions in sales and marketing that are straight out of college. We've hired some engineering roles that are straight out of college as well. We hire tons of different engineering roles that either have work experience or out of master's programs, and that's for a range of stuff. So software, for data science, for mechanical engineering, for project engineers. We've actually met with a lot of success poaching very directly from the oil industry. But Exxon, Chevron, Schlumberger, these companies, they have great hiring processes and great training processes, and really hardworking, talented engineers, and we love them. And it's kind of a 2-for, because you get amazing talent for clean energy, and at the same time you're kind of sapping the problem.
Yeah.
So it's
Bleeding the giants.
Yeah, exactly. But that said, some of those companies are doing a lot of renewable development too, although we try not to poach from there.
Okay, so coming back to you and your career, I mean, you've had incredible success very quickly. And you did talk about some of the challenges early on at Carbon Lighthouse, but if you can point to sort of one big setback and what you learned from it, it might be helpful for people to hear that.
Yeah, I could point to hundreds of setbacks. Okay, we had our second ever client. One of our subcontractors wired a pressure sensor backwards. And long story short, this ended up overpressurizing the building and blew open all of the doors, and you couldn't close the doors or windows, and the ducts were full of a howling noise. So this is bad. This is a major security problem, and challenging for people in some areas of the building to get work done. That is bad, and it's really bad because it's our second or maybe our third customer, and so we really need this to work out because it's so hard to win customers, and we have to have references, and we need them to be happy. And here, luckily, my instinct is just to be very transparent with people and to take responsibility for stuff that goes wrong when it's your fault. And I don't know, my parents raised me well, and I had that as a 5-year-old, but that was really key because called the customer, told them what was going on, that we were on it. And it took us a while to fix this problem, I think 3 days. And so thankfully we could undo what we had done and just run the fans at a fixed speed. So it wasn't you couldn't close the doors for 3 days. You couldn't close the doors for 3 hours. But the value of transparency and honesty and forthright communication ended up being huge because that client, their perspective on this was look, stuff goes wrong in buildings all the time. This was more annoying than other things that have gone wrong, but less annoying than other stuff too.
Right.
But you guys dealt with it in a way that was very easy to deal with. And they ended up taking us to the rest of their portfolio, and they ended up investing in the company. And they've been huge supporters. Yeah, and it certainly wasn't because we did the job well the first time. It was because we had very good customer service and acted with the integrity we would want to see people. If we'd been on the other side, that's how we wanted them to act. So we acted that way.
That's a great parable. What are you most proud of?
Before we started the company, I thought we would face a lot of challenges and have a lot of success, and that it would be a wild, thrilling roller coaster. And that has been true. Except that we faced way more challenges than I expected. But we persevered, and that was fine. I think one of the things I didn't see coming, which is now one of the greatest sources of joy and gratitude in my life, is how we could create a space at Carbon Lighthouse where people felt so safe and supported. And so both physically safe, because we do work in buildings and there are hazards there, climbing up ladders, opening panels, working occasionally with live electrical equipment. So obviously safety is incredibly important at all times. But I think we have created an environment where it's very inclusive, it is very diverse, and it's an area where people have become very close friends. And an example of this is our VP of engineering was one of the groomsmen at our VP of sales wedding. And they met here, and often those functions...
I was going to say, engineering and sales.
Yeah, exactly. Often they do not get along that well, but Eric and Matt have become just very, very close, and there's tons of relationships like that at this company. And so to be able to just witness the true joy people have gotten from being colleagues with each other I'm just incredibly thankful to be able to see that when I come into work, and to have played some tiny role in creating an environment where that's possible, and I'm very grateful for that.
So last question is really focused on your role as founder CEO. And I founded 2 companies years ago and know what a burn it can be to do it. I think part of what you're describing in terms of the culture here is reflected, has to be reflected by leadership, right? And
Hope so.
And we hope. I guess my question is, with a company that's growing this fast, with a mission that's this urgent, and also with a young family, how do you hold it together? I mean, what's your secret, or what are you learning about not so much balance, but about kind of the fusion between running your life and family and the company and tackling climate change at the same time?
Yeah, fusion is a much better word than balance. Because I wouldn't say I have a lot of balance. I have a lot of work, but I am extremely happy at home, and I think fusion is the right word for that. But a bunch of things. I don't think there's one thing, but there's probably 3 that have been really important for me. So they are: get a crazy team in terms of how good and competent and nice they are, and then trust them. They are self-care, and be home on weekends and be present when you're home. So in order, with regards to having a ridiculously competent and joyful team, we have been incredibly careful and deliberate with our hiring process. We read more than 400 pages of academic research before developing our hiring process. We summarized it all, so highly encourage everyone to go to carbonlighthouse.com/how-we-hire. And it's 10-page summary on everything that works and doesn't in hiring. And that's led to very low turnover, but also this team I can just trust completely. And so I don't have stress at work related to team at all. It is unbelievably fortunate. And so whatever the problem is, I can work with colleagues to get it done in a way that is joyful and where I can give them the goal and the resources to do it and get the heck out of their way. So that's been huge. Self-care has been huge also. So sleep, exercise, obviously this is personal to me, but sleep, exercise, meditation on my subway commute has been real helpful. If I do those 3 things, I seem to be okay. And then presence at home, I often have to work after the kids go to bed. I travel almost every single week, but I have to work a lot of weekends, but I make sure I know when I am going to do that work. And once I've calendared that out, it doesn't disrupt me with my family. So I will try really hard to be home for dinner when I'm not traveling, and I will be present with the kids and be present for bedtime and enjoy that, because I know at 8:30 I can go back to work. And I don't travel on weekends, so I'm always home for weekends, which has been great because actually my wife has to work some weekends.
Yeah. Yeah, that's you have a lot of awareness built around those three facets, and I congratulate you for that, because a lot of I was going to say first time entrepreneurs, but just a lot of entrepreneurs in general, it's really just work, and they lose sight of self-care, they lose sight of family, they lose sight of other interests.
Yeah, I mean, we're also bigger now. Like I didn't have my metaphysical house in order that way in the early years at all. But I also didn't have to. We didn't have kids, and my wife's a doctor and was in residency, so she was never home anyways. So I could just happily work 90 hours a week and not miss anything. Whereas now I can't do that. But I also had gifts from both my dad and my father-in-law, which is my dad is an entrepreneur too. And I think, at least so far as I could tell as a kid, he did a good job of being present for dinner, even though he had to work after dinner almost every single night. I can remember when I was a kid. And then my father-in-law traveled a lot for work, and he gave me the gift of just don't do it on weekends. Mm-hmm. And so I had a lot of help with those two things. And then self-care, I don't know, since I was in high school, if I got sleep and exercise, I was good.
Well, Brenden, thanks so much for your time, and thanks for the amazing work that you're doing for our environment.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Dave. Thank you so much for coming in, and yeah, so excited to get to speak with you. It's an honor.
The Sustainability Leaders Podcast is a resource of Jobs with Impact. Our engineer and associate producer is Ian Swanky. Theme music is also by Ian Swanky. I'm David Rosenheim. If you like the show, please rate and review us on iTunes or your preferred platform. And be sure to tell your friends and colleagues who want to make a difference. Thanks for listening. See you next week.